Paraguay. You've heard the name, or maybe just a whisper of it. But did you know there was a very real moment in history where it almost stopped existing entirely? Like wiped clean off the map. And the fact that we're sitting here talking about it today, that's already a story worth telling. So in the beginning there was the Guarani. They'd been living between the Paraguay and Parana rivers for roughly 2,000 years as hunters, farmers, warriors. Basically everything they needed to be to survive. The women grew corn and cassava, while the men did all the hunting. And when raiders from the Gran Chaco came knocking, the Guarani decided to cross the river and fight all the way to the edges of the Inca Empire. Then, in 1526, an Italian working for Spain named Sebastian Cabot sailed up the Parana River and thought, this looks promising. And well, he was partially right, because in 1537, when the Spanish had set up a permanent base at Asuncion to look for gold, they found none. What they found instead were the Guarani, but instead of the usual colonial script of conquest and collapse, the Spanish settlers and the Guarani tried a different approach. They kind of merged via intermarriage, and it happened at a massive scale. From that mix came a completely new culture that's not fully Spanish and not 100% indigenous. They're called the Mestizo Paraguayan. We'll talk more about them later, but first, let's continue with our history lesson. Because after the Spanish came the Jesuits in 1609, and boy were they ambitious. They built 30 self-contained mission communities across the region, housing 150,000 indigenous people at their peak. These communities, they were part church, part city-state, and part economic powerhouse. They were technically doing it all, and even we have to admit it was impressive. In fact, it was apparently too impressive because the Spanish landowners around Asuncion started watching all of this and thought, why do these priests have more power than us? Hence the conflict. But long story short, there was enough political pressure build up that in 1767, Spain kicked the Jesuits out of all its colonies. The missions emptied out, their buildings started to crumble, and today these sites have become ruins that you can visit when you fly to Paraguay, which, by the way, I linked in the description below. Just click it and it'll take you to amazing flight and accommodation deals in Paraguay. But going back, when 1776 rolled around, the Jesuits were gone and Spain had to reshuffle its colonial structure. In the end, Paraguay was stuck under the rule of Buenos Aires, which they were not too thrilled about. So when Buenos Aires declared their independence from Spain in 1810, they thought that everyone under them was coming along, including Paraguay. But Paraguay had a different idea. They actually defeated a Buenos Aires army to make it clear that they were not coming along. They wanted their own independence, and on May 14th, 1811, they got exactly what they wanted. Though we're still miles away from a happy ending. See, they still had to figure out how to rule themselves. That's when a lawyer named José Gaspar Rodríguez de Francia clawed his way to the top. And by 1816, Congress named him dictator for life. Which was, to say the least, a huge mistake. Because what did he do? He sealed the borders, crushed the church, confiscated the wealth of the Spanish elite, and ran Paraguay like a closed-off experiment where he controlled every variable. So the real question is, did it work? Well, kind of. The country became self-sufficient, completely isolated from the chaos of its neighbours. And when he died in 1840, Paraguay was stable, yet it was still isolated from the rest of the world. Though not for long, because his successor Carlos Antonio Lopez slowly opened things up. He started with railways, then a telegraph, then an iron foundry, modern stuff. And the successor after him, his son Francisco Solano Lopez, inherited all of it. Did he take care of it? Well, let's just say he looked at the regional map and made one catastrophic decision. See, in 1864, Brazil invaded Uruguay. And for some reason, Francisco Solano Lopez decided Paraguay should intervene. Here's how that went down. He warned Brazil to back off. Brazil ignored him, so he declared war on Brazil. But since Argentina wouldn't let his troops cross their land, he declared war on Argentina too. Uruguay, who was run by a pro-Brazilian government, joined the other side, which meant Paraguay was at war with all three of its neighbours at once. What a nightmare. It was called the War of the Triple Alliance, and it happened from 1864 to 1870. By the end of it, more than half of Paraguay's entire population was dead, including Lopez. After that, Paraguay spent decades crawling back. They won the Chaco War in the 1930s against Bolivia and gained some territory in the west. Then in 1954, General Alfredo Stroessner seized power and held it for 35 years. That is, until his own military overthrew him in 1989. So they decided something new. What about democracy? Well, it started out messy and imperfect, and occasionally on fire, but hey, they're still at it to this day, so they must be doing something right. Right? I mean, just look at this place. Paraguay sits in the dead center of South America, spanning about 406,752 square kilometers. That's a little more than 157,000 square miles. Beside it, you've got Brazil, Argentina, and Bolivia. Then, in the middle, you've got the Paraguay River cutting straight through. On the east side, you have rolling green hills, dense forest, rich farmland, and most of the country's 7 million people. This is where Asunción sits. That's the capital, along with most of the major hubs like Ciudad del Este, Encarnación, and Villarrica. All in all, this section's pretty lush and productive. Now moving on to the west, that's where you'll find the Chaco. It's this vast wilderness that makes up about 60% of the country's total land area. Compared to the east, this side's filled with dry forest, open savanna, cattle ranches that seem to stretch forever, and wildlife that almost everyone's been dying to see. I'm talking jaguars, capybaras, caimans, giant anteaters. And if you'll notice, I didn't mention any sea or ocean once. That's because Paraguay is a landlocked country. But no ocean doesn't mean no access, because they've got the Paraguay and Paraná rivers on their side. These water features connect all the way to the Atlantic, and fun fact, while people argue over the exact meaning, one of the most famous interpretations of the name Paraguay from the Guarani is the river that gives birth to the sea. So yeah, they may not have vast oceans, but they've got rivers, and that's enough to run their trade, their transport, and most importantly, their energy. Which takes us right to this spot. Believe it or not, Paraguay is one of the fastest growing economies in South America. We're talking a projected GDP growth of 4.4% for 2026, coming off a massive 6.6% high in 2025. I mean, for a landlocked country with no oil and no coastline, that's pretty impressive. But it gets better, because in 2026, Paraguay has taken a massive seat at the global financial table. They just finished hosting the annual meeting of the Inter-American Development Bank in Asunción. It's been decades since they've held that kind of spotlight. Add to that their rising influence in the IMF and World Bank circles, and you start to realise that the world is finally paying attention to Paraguay. So how did they do it? Well, this might come as a shock to you. But it was all thanks to soybeans and water. Paraguay is one of the world's top soybean exporters. In fact, record-breaking harvests have been flooding the market, bringing in a massive wave of US dollars. Because of that, the Guarani, which is their national currency, has been on a tear. It surged nearly 20% against the US dollar over the past year, sitting around 6,330 Guaranis per dollar as of April 2026. In other words, strong harvests, record exports, and more dollars flowing in than out. I mean, for a country that defaulted on its debt and was in a full-blown economic crisis back in 2002, that's a serious turnaround. But I haven't even talked about the water yet. So, remember those rivers? Well, the Itaipu Dam, which they run with Brazil on the Paraná River, is one of the largest hydroelectric plants on the planet. Which means Paraguay's got more than enough energy to share. Which they do, since they export the vast majority of it to their neighbours. So you've got clean energy and consistent revenue, all of it flowing out of a simple river system. Now, I'm not saying Paraguay's got a perfect economic story, because those things are hard to come by. See, with every pro, there's usually a con. In this case, even though a stronger Guarani sounds great on paper, it doesn't always translate to lower prices at the grocery store. Global shipping costs and fuel prices are still high, and they're eating up all those savings. On top of that, the exporters, especially those soybean farmers, are actually getting squeezed. Since the dollar is weaker against their local currency, they're getting fewer guaranis for every ton they sell abroad. Plus, they've got to deal with land inequality, which has been a thorn in their side since the 1880s. So maybe Paraguay is not the economic miracle we thought it was. Or at the very least, they still have a lot to fix in order to grow. Now, after hearing all of that, you might expect Paraguay to have a culture that's more guarded, or closed off, or probably still healing. But instead you get tereré. It's their national drink. It's basically yerba mate brewed cold, packed with medicinal herbs, and shared in a single cup passed around to whoever's nearby. Friend, stranger, it really doesn't matter. All you do is sit, share, and talk. That's the whole thing. And honestly, if you're keen on understanding Paraguayan culture, that cup is everything you need to know. Why? Because this is a people who have been through the absolute ringer. I'm talking wars, dictators, poverty, heck, even near extinction. Yet they still came out the other side with a bright smile on their faces and genuine hospitality coursing through their bones. So yes, no matter what challenges they go through, their core is still intact. Remember those first mestizo families from our history lesson? Well, they're the reason Paraguay feels so different today. Because while the rest of the continent was trying to look more like Europe, Paraguayans were busy doubling down on their roots. So, in essence, they didn't just merge. No, they actually built a culture that kept the indigenous side intact. That's why the Guarani spirit never left. In fact, if you keep your ears open, you'll hear it everywhere. Guarani is the language of the home, the streets, and the soul. And it's in the music too. There's this genre called the guarania. It's slow and heavy and gorgeous. When you hear it, it's like someone poured centuries of emotion into an instrument and just let it flow. It's nothing short of mesmerizing. Then there's the food. Among all the delicacies, you've got to try the embeju. It's a crispy, cheesy cassava starch cake that's been on Paraguayan tables since way before any European showed up. I mean, if a recipe survives for centuries, it's got to be good, right? Even during the 35-year dictatorship, when free thought was basically illegal, these traditions kept moving, passing from one generation to the next. And I think that resilience comes from an old Guarani myth, Ivih Mahra Ehi, meaning a land without evil. It's essentially this idea of a paradise that Guarani believed was always just beyond the horizon. But looking at everything we talked about so far, turns out they didn't need to find it. They were standing on it all along. Truly, I'm glad they found their Ivih Mahra Ehi. How about you? What's your idea of a paradise? Let me know in the comments down below. And as always, if you enjoyed this video, you'll love this next one.